Hello, it's Dawn Michelle and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought we would do a fun video sort of calling me out on my own BS. So today we're gonna take a look at decks I make an exception for. So these are like decks that break my deal breakers. So a lot of us who have, collect tarot or work with a lot of different tarot decks, we kind of have some things that we tend to look for in decks and some things that we tend to kind of like shy away from because they don't work for us, they're not our favorite, whatever the case may be. And I don't feel like I have a ton of what I would consider deal breakers, but I do have a couple of things that really like ruffle my feathers about decks, some of which I've like done whole ranty videos on. But there's always an exception to that rule. And today I thought we would take a look at the decks that completely break the rule for me, and yet I love them anyway. So that is the spirit in which this entire video is intended. We're gonna take a look at decks that break my deal breakers and that I love anyway. As always with videos like these, there's no disrespect meant to the deck, the creator, the publisher, or anybody who has any love or connection to the deck itself. These are all decks that I absolutely adore and that I use quite regularly in my practice or that I have purchased for very specific reasons. And so like we're coming at it from that point of view of I love these decks despite the fact that they do the very things that I say I don't like in my decks. So it's definitely meant to be taken in a fun-loving spirit. With that said, let's just jump right into like probably my number one actual deal breaker, and the one that very, very rarely do I actually make an exception for. I always say that I don't like large decks. So this is the Diablo Tarot, and I've mentioned this deck, I could get it turned around many, many times on my channel. I have done like full like love letter videos to this deck. So clearly it's not a case of me knocking this deck or having any issue with this deck, but it does break one of my deal breakers in that I don't buy decks that are oversized. I have a hard enough time with my little hands shuffling a normal sized deck. Like a regular sized tarot deck is a challenge for me. A normal sized oracle deck is a challenge for me. And then you throw in this massive, massive deck that is bigger than my hand. And this should be a complete deal breaker for me. The saving grace with this particular deck is the cardstock it's actually quite lovely. It's very thin and flexible. It's also a beautiful matte. And this one also has the I don't like the foil gilding stuff on the front of my decks in a general sense. But I actually like it in the borders. And I think it's just because it's in the borders. Like some of that like cold foil stamping and stuff, like it's just too much for me. It's too blingy and I find it really distracting. But this, because it's just in the border area, like I'm fine with it. Anyway, back to the deal breaker of this deck, or what should have been a deal breaker, is its size, because it is massive. And anytime I talk about decks being like large or oversized, like this is the deck that I always kind of poke fun at, because like I'm always looking at you, Diablo Tarot, why are you so big? I do not understand. You would think that that would make it completely unusable, and especially when you're looking at like my reading space here. Like one card pretty much takes up my whole reading space. Granted, if I'm not filming, I can make more room, right? Let's be realistic. Tarot in real life, right? This is tarot in YouTube land. Tarot in real life means that sometimes some of this stuff gets moved out of the way so that I can make room for cards. But the thing with this deck is that I really love the imagery. I love the interpretation, and like I think the artwork is so cool. I love the way it reads. I have a personal connection to the Diablo world, the game and the story that this deck is based on. And so for all of those reasons, I completely forgive it for its ginormous size. This is one of those cases of like bigger isn't always better, y'all. I still to this day do not know why this deck is so big. Other than it does really allow you to like fall into this artwork, because it's so gigantic that like you just can't avoid but falling into the artwork. And you can really see the details, and I do really appreciate that about it. I love being able to see the details on faces, even though they're like super shadowy here. Particularly because like a lot of these cards are like actually based on actual characters. So that's great to be able to tell who they are. But like in working with it, it does mean that like I pretty much only use one card at a time with this, and I start pulling out other tarots. So it kind of has that energy of like, it does limit what I can do with it because it's so massive. But like, I don't care. I love this deck. I have done so many videos singing its praises because I love it so much. I work with it a lot with the horror tarot now, and that works beautifully because I can pull one of these as like a main card, or one or two. Really, like 3 is the most I've ever had on the table, I think, with this deck. Not only just because of the size, but because of the sheer amount of detail in the artwork, that more than, you know, 2-3 cards, and like there's just too much going on the table for me. But when we're talking about decks that break a deal breaker, I don't buy decks that are oversized because I have enough trouble shuffling normal size decks, and yet I love this deck and I work with it all the time. So kind of along those same lines, another one of my deal breakers, and I'm gonna put that in quotes, air quotes, because like, again, this is me calling myself out on my own BS. I don't like decks that have weird shapes. That is entirely true. But there are decks that I make exception for. I've just pulled out the alchemy one, but the archetypes deck could just as easily have fit in this slot as well. So I've talked about this deck probably at length. I think I've ranted about it a little bit too, like, to be perfectly honest, because like this is a weird shaped deck, and I have the most difficult time physically working with this deck. The weird shape means it's super hard to shuffle. I've had, when I mentioned it in my monthly wrap up, that I talked about working with this deck. I honestly work with this deck every single month. So clearly this shape isn't enough of a deterrent for me. But again, it's like a deck that I make exception for because I have had lots of weird shaped decks. And by weird, I mean anything that isn't square or rectangle. So that's like my definition of weird. If it is round or hexagonal, or like, I don't even know, whatever weird shape there could be. But anyway, this particular deck has the weirdest shape that is so difficult for me to work with. It really bothers me when cards get all flipped around like this, like we're seeing it happen. It kind of like makes me dizzy. I don't like it. It really takes me out of the experience of working with the cards when I have to sit here and flip everything up the right way. And that's one of the reasons why I don't work with reversals anymore. It's just like, it's a personal thing. I hate having to flip cards around all the time. This one is actually better than a round deck. So like round decks, I can't even figure out really how to work into my practice in the way that I read with cards, because so much of the interpretation of the card it does matter where it is on the table, and like what it's touching, what it's next to, what it's surrounded by. And round cards are really quite difficult to do that with, and like to have things line up. And I need things to line up. Things that don't line up make me anxious. And so for me to be able to really drop into a reading, I need the cards to work for me in that way, like physically work for me. And I've done lots of videos like ranting about decks that don't physically work for me. Like, it's a thing, right? But this is a deck that I completely make an exception for because it's freaking amazing. I love this deck. The guidebook is fantastic. The artwork is phenomenal. I get so much out of working with this deck, and I have integrated it into so many different aspects of my life. Like, just beyond my tarot practice, I have used it a lot for writing. I use it a lot in creativity work. I use it a lot when I am creatively blocked. And it just like, there's so many things this deck can do. And the guidebook is fantastic. Other than, as I mentioned in other videos, the numbering is not the same on the cards as it is in the guidebook, the way it's literally numbered. It's got Roman numerals on the cards, which are very difficult for me to work with beyond a certain point, right? Like, it's not that I don't know them, it's just I have to sit there and I have to count it out. And I don't really want to sit there and be counting out the card number while I'm in the middle of a reading to be able to look it up in the guidebook. So like, that's a thing too, right? But this deck, y'all, is amazing, and there's so much that I can do with it. But like, this flipping things around, like, I should have just taken the time to straighten them all out before I made the video. But this really illustrates how the more I work with, the more cards I work with in this deck, the more frustrated I get with it. So I do tend to keep it to just 1 or 2 cards. I'll deal with the shuffle, I'll get the draw, I'll deal with trying to find the card in the guidebook. And then once I get past all of that, then I can really dive into the work with this deck. But like, as far as like being a deal breaker, yeah, weird shaped decks are a deal breaker for me. I have very, very few of them. But I make an exception for this one. I make an exception for the Archetypes deck, the Wild Unknown Archetypes deck. And I've also made an exception for the Citadel because that one also has a weird shape to it. That one doesn't bother me as much though. I don't have as much trouble working with that one. But again, it's just like, it's a physical thing, right? This is a physical tool. I want to be able to work with it in a physical way. And despite the fact that it's weird shape, like I freaking love this deck and it's amazing. And like I could sing its praises all day long because I have gotten so much out of working with this deck. It is a deck that I work with every single month. It's on my table. Whether I talk about it in a video or show it in a monthly wrap up or anything, it's always at hand. And so for that reason, like it's definitely a deck that I make an exception for because it's so worth making the exception for. Okay, so while we're on the topic of deal breakers that are kind of like a physical thing, let's talk about cardstock. I'm just gonna go through these ones pretty quickly because I did a whole like ranty video about cardstock because I do have really big frustrations over getting a deck that I can't physically use because this is a physical tool, right? So this is the textured tarot. I mentioned this in that video. This has like this deck is so stunning. It's so stunning. But it has like, I cannot remember the name of the cardstock. It's a special sort of eco-friendly cardstock, which is fantastic, but it bends and creases so easy. It's super thick and it makes it where I'm almost like scared to work with this deck because I'm so afraid I'm gonna ruin it. And I have nearly bent cards. I have seen people who have bent cards. You definitely cannot riffle shuffle this cardstock. You will ruin it if you do that. And riffle shuffling is a part of my sort of reading routine, my reading ritual. So when I can't do that, it's a little bit of an interruption to my practice. But again, I make an exception because this deck is stunning. I absolutely love the artwork. I love the interpretations of the tarot in it. It's just to physically work with this deck is really, really frustrating and like a bit scary. Like I get nervous every time I have this deck in my hands, and that's like not a feeling that you want to have when you're like working with your tarot, right? You don't want to be nervous to pull out your cards, and I am, and because I love this deck, I'm so afraid I'm gonna ruin it. Totally a deck worth making that exception for, even though it's like a deal breaker thing for me. Okay, so I said I wasn't gonna talk about cardstock for a really long time, but like that honestly is my #1 thing. It's like my number. It's why I did like a whole ranty video on it. This one is the Brady Tarot. I also really am not a fan of this rose petally finish types of decks. But this is a deck that I completely make an exception for because it's amazing and I love it. I really enjoy working with it. It's really heavy. Like it's literally heavy in the hand. It's very difficult to shuffle. It's like, it feels nice when you just touch the cards, but they stick and they like do not shuffle well. Like even it clumps really badly. So that can make it like really hard to like actually work with the deck. But again, like this deck, the Brady Tarot, is so amazing. The guidebook is phenomenal and I just love working with it. It's so real and so raw and it just gets like right down into the root of things. I totally make an exception for this deck all the time. I love this card. Oh my goodness, I'm so glad that one's on top. It's my favorite. Like stuff like this is so brilliant that I will make an exception for size, cardstock, all of that stuff all day long if the deck is brilliant, and this one is. Okay, so let's start kind of transitioning into some other categories of deal breakers. Let's start with the Talisman Tarot. There's the backs. It's very large. It's also like shiny gold gilded. Any sort of shiny gilding is not my jam. I don't like it in a general sense. This is really nice gilding, so I don't mind it. But where this deck should be a deal breaker is that I do not like super maximalist collage. I rehome most every sort of maximalist collage. And by maximalist collage, I mean like there is a ton of stuff collaged into each of these images. I tend more towards minimalist collage, stuff like the spolia, stuff like the rosebud, where there's less texture, less things, less elements on the card. I find in general these like really heavily itemized collage decks to be almost anxiety inducing most of the time. This is the one exception to that rule, because this deck, for whatever reason, like I get what it's saying. The collage work is done really well. It doesn't make me feel anxious or like I'm drowning in this imagery. And I think it's the little touches and probably the time and energy that I've spent working with this deck, because like I get what the things are, like they make sense to me. And a lot of times when I get these really maximalist collage decks, like it's overwhelming. I find it to be too much, and they usually end up moving on because like, I mean, look at this one with this Princess of Cups. There is so much going on in this card. And like theoretically, that should be a deal breaker for me, because like in the past, stuff like that has been very anxiety inducing for me. But for whatever reason, this deck, totally cool, man. I love it. I have absolutely no issue working with it. I love all the elements that are included. I've done a lot of deep dive work with this deck. Love this Hermit. See, there's not as much going on here. I mean, it might feel like it because we have this, like the canyons here with all the rocks, but that is like one image. And there's just a couple other images layered over the top of that. That's a little bit more in the minimalistic side. So there are some cards in here that lean that way. But for the most part, like it's a pretty maximalist collage deck. And I love it. It like, even though it's oversized, even though it's gilded, even though it's a maximalist collage deck, this deck so works for me. I really enjoy working with it. I get pretty much everything that's on the cards. Like it makes sense to me why it's there. And like it evokes something in me, and it's not anxiety. And so that's the big thing, right? So yeah, this is an amazing collage deck. I highly recommend it. It leans pretty thothy too, which is fantastic because I definitely don't have a ton of Thoth inspired decks in my collection, and I do really appreciate that about it. But yeah, again, for that maximalist collage, like that's usually a deal breaker for me. And most of them, like I try all the time, and I bring them in, and then they just kind of, they make me anxious, and then out they go. But this is the one exception to the rule that like I love working with it, and it's still here and it's gonna stay. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of decks that have like just artwork that I just like, it's just not my jam. It's just not my thing. But I love the decks. So this is the Power of Surrender cards, and from a designer standpoint, here's the box. I like, it's also glossy, and it's like kind of that old school Oracle, which there's a little bit of nostalgia there with that I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool, like old school Oracle. This deck, like aesthetically speaking, is not my jam. And like right now, this whole video, I've got neighbors mowing or trimming a tree or something, and my dog is wandering, and there's just all the background noises. Also, the birds are chirping like in Ash's room. So that's also not my jam either, but we're gonna roll with it. Same as I roll with this deck. So this deck is kind of like aesthetically all the things that I really don't care for. Like it's got weird colored border things. There's this weird design thing. There's just the one image that's a photograph that 9 times out of 10 I don't get. Like I don't get why that image was chosen. But it's got the most amazing keywords and the most amazing messages. And so for that, that's what I use the card for. So this is like a deck that I don't use it for its imagery. I use it for its messaging. So here we have like surrender, obsessive thinking, surrender to passion. Like every card is a surrender. And then the messages on the bottom are just fantastic. So we have surrender the drama. So like no matter how emotionally charged the situation, remain calm and don't contribute to the drama. Staying centered will help resolve the issue more quickly. That's a great message for being on YouTube, just saying. But like I don't get the images, like they just don't first of all, I don't like a lot of them, and they just don't really match a lot of the energy of the card. Like the polar bears, like I don't get that. But this is a deck that it's not about the imagery. It's not about the card size, the design, the aesthetic of it. This is about the messaging. This is a deck that I pull when I want this type of energy and I want this kind of message, and I do not care what it looks like on the table, because that's not the point, right? You know, I love a good aesthetic thing, right? I love aesthetics. I love pretty things. I am a designer, like that's how my brain's wired, and that's where my training is. So coming across decks like this, like it does tweak my designer brain to go, oh my goodness, I just can't. But I can, because the messages in this deck are so phenomenal that I'm just like, I don't even care what it looks like. Just can't even care, because the messages are where it's at. The messages are what matter. And so again, I completely make an exception, because this one is 100% worth breaking all my deal breakers for. Okay, then I just have to mention this deck, because this is like my ultimate, I should not like this deck. It breaks all of my deal breakers. It is oversized, and I've trimmed it. So it had a big white border around it, and I've trimmed it, and it's still massive. It's glossy, clearly, because you can see like my whole camera set up there. Again, like I said, I trimmed it, I've edged it, and this deck, like, I should not like. It is full on like Indigo Child Starseed energy, and it's just really usually not my thing. The artwork is definitely not my thing. Again, we're back to like, there's design issues with the art itself that really should bug me, and in any other deck probably would, but like, I don't even care. I absolutely adore this deck. I love working with it. There is just something about it, despite all the ways that it like really shouldn't work for me, it totally does. It's physically hard to work with. It's super shiny. It's got weird artwork. Some of the language like this, just no, but I don't care. I love it. I love it. It's such a fun one. And there's just something about the way that it reads for me that it just like, I don't know. It's like, it gets me, even though it's like strange and I shouldn't like it. And it's just like all the wrong things. But it's amazing, and I totally love it. Like, this deck will never go anywhere. And sadly, I think this deck is out of print now, so I do apologize, but like, it's not hard to find a copy, and I don't think they're very expensive. If this kind of like weird, like early 90s, maybe into the 2000s, I don't know, 90s, 2000s artwork is like your thing. It so reminds me of my past. I think that's where it is. Cause like, obviously like I'm a designer by trade. So like, you know, I was doing design work at that time. And it just reminds me of like when we were first learning how to work in, you know, digital graphic design stuff. Right. And it's just, I don't know. I shouldn't like it, but I do. I adore it. It's all the wrong things, but I love it for that. And maybe that's a little bit why I do love it, because it's like all the wrong things, but it still reads so phenomenally for me that I just absolutely adore this deck. So it's definitely never going anywhere, but it breaks all my deal breakers. Okay, so I have just two more decks to share with you. I just want to talk about this Tarot of Curious Creatures really quickly, because this is a deck that like, I was like, no. Absolutely not. This is not my jam. This is not my aesthetic, right? The backs are beautiful though. I have edged mine. And like, I'm just like this weird anthropomorphized like animal heads on people bodies, like real people bodies, like photographs. I don't mind anthropomorphized decks if it's like very cartoony, like the Northern Animal. That doesn't bother me at all. This usually bothers me. I do not like real animal heads on real people, but this deck I make an exception for, because oh my goodness, it just so works. And it's really not my thing, right? I mean, I do like weird quirky decks, but it's really colorful, and I don't know, it's just it really shouldn't be something that I like. And mostly it's because I don't like that. I think it's weird. Most of the time it's off-putting for me. Any other deck that I've ever gotten that has real animal heads on real people, I have very quickly moved out of my collection because there's something about that that just does not work for me. But in this deck, it's amazing and it's done really, really well for the most part. My only complaint is that really there could have been like body diversity in this deck. There was multiple opportunities for body diversity that didn't happen. So that's really like my only complaint about this deck. Otherwise, like I adore it. It's so fun and cheeky. I love the way it reads. It's just kind of like, it was an amazing surprise deck, but like, again, this is like generally this sort of real life anthropomorphized animal thing is a deal breaker for me. I think it might be the only deck in my collection that actually has this sort of setup. I do have a couple of decks with cartoon anthropomorphized animals because again, those don't bother me. But this deck is like, it's so amazing. I love it. And I so enjoy working with it. It's such a great reader. And again, it'll probably never go anywhere in my collection. But when we're talking about deal breakers, like that's usually a deal breaker for me. And I make an exception for this deck because again, like every deck we looked at is totally worth it. Okay, let's end this video on a deck that is definitely should be a deal breaker, but like it's a fandom thing, so I don't care. This is the Supernatural Tarot. And the thing about this deck is, and what makes it a deal breaker for me is the fact that it has no idea if it's a pip deck or a scenic deck. And here's the backs. And that's really the thing with it, right? Is like some of them are very pippy, and then we get some that are like, well, those are all pippy, and that's a court. So, and then some of them are like, they're people, they're scenic, and it just like that's a little bit more scenic. And then we get some of them that are just like very pippy. So like, I don't mind a pip deck. I don't mind a scenic deck. Just don't try to be both. Like, make up your mind. And in general, like that, let me be honest, if this wasn't the Supernatural Tarot, I would have not bought it, knowing that. And if I hadn't known that going in, I would have definitely, if not returned it, I would have rehomed it because this weird hybrid thing of like, it's a pip deck. Oh, wait, it's not a pip deck. Oh, maybe it is. It's just, it interrupts the reading process for me. Like, I'm fine with pip decks. I love pip decks. But just like decide what you're gonna be. So yeah, but I keep it anyway, and I totally make an exception for it because it's like, it's a fandom deck, and like I've gotten into Supernatural, so I will probably always keep it for that reason because like, oh, cool. Okay, let's end with there with our boys on top because this is the whole reason I keep this deck is because it's a fandom deck. And I make exception. I make exception for all my fandom decks. Like I could have put pretty much any fandom deck that I had issue with in this category because there are sometimes when it's a fandom thing or it's something that I'm really personally invested in or attached to, I will totally make an exception. I will make an exception for every deal breaker I have if it's a deck that has some sort of personal significance and meaning to me. So I think that was just like important to note. Okay, so there you go. That's a look at some of my decks that I make an exception for, decks that break my deal breakers and that I love anyway. Again, this video was meant, you know, fully in the language of love. I really enjoy working with them. And I did, like, I want to say how wonderful they are despite the fact that they, you know, break my deal breakers. And like also just to mention that, you know, sometimes decks that they don't have they don't tick all the boxes. They can still be really, really fantastic decks and still add a wonderful layer to your practice. Like not every deck is going to tick every box. In fact, I don't know that I even have a single deck that really ticks all the boxes for me. I've got some that get really, really close, but like there's no such thing, I don't think, as a perfect deck. So it's really interesting to look at, I think, where I make an exception and like for what reasons I make exceptions for. And I think it's also like important to like keep that in mind just for myself when I'm like looking at my decks and talking about decks and stuff like that, that there are things that I have like deal breakers, right? And I'm like, this is a thing I never do, but never say never, because the moment that I say in a video or whatever that I'm not going to do this thing, I will inevitably do the thing. Same with like, I will never buy an oversized deck. Sure I will. I will never buy a weird fandom deck. Sure I will. I'll never buy a deck that I can't riffle shuffle. Of course I will. Right? If like the deck is worth it, then it's worth it. And like, it doesn't matter. So, because I kind of wanted to, even though there's a little bit of ranty in here, like, because there is just a little bit of ranty, right? Some of this is production value stuff. So like I get a little bit more ranty about production value stuff because that can be adjusted, right? Also, like publishers that spend way more money on the boxing in the book and like completely neglect the cards, that's kind of a deal breaker. I totally forgot that one, but I could have included it because I do have a deck that hits that note where the cards are absolute crap. They're terrible quality, but the book in the box is really, really nice. And it's like, I don't care. I don't work with the box, right? First of all, the box I really don't care about because I don't work with the box. The book is like, as long as it's readable, that's all I need in a book. In my deck of cards though, something I'm gonna physically work with, like I need that to work. So anyway, that's my ranting aside, my big long ramble about decks I make an exception for. Again, this was meant to be fun and like kind of poking at myself and calling me on my own BS. And it's also a good reminder of like, never say never. Because the minute I say never, then I do. So anyway, I would love to know what decks you make an exception for if you have any in your collection. So, you know, feel free to like make a VR or just drop it in the comments below. That would be fantastic. As always, you'll find links for everything I've shown here in the description box of this video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.